The night was cold, unusually so for a summer evening. Connor never cared much for the weather, though. He had other things on his mind, like the party he had left an hour ago. His family was wealthy, and he was used to getting whatever he wanted. That included people. Girls threw themselves at him, and he never really needed to ask twice, except for her. She was different, the girl from the streets, hawking oranges at the corner of his estate. She wasn't like the others, quiet, beautiful in a raw, unpolished way, with eyes that spoke of hardship. Connor had tried to buy her, the same way he bought everything else, but she had turned him down, flatly. He didn't like being rejected. Earlier that evening, when he saw her again selling oranges to one of the workers at his party, his temper flared. Embarrassed by the rejection, he grabbed her by the arm and mocked her in front of his friends, calling her names, pulling at her scarf, and trying to humiliate her. Her eyes had darkened, and she stared into his soul with a look he hadn't seen before, something ancient, something unsettling. And then she whispered, "You will learn." Connor scoffed, shaking off the strange feeling she left behind. He was too proud, too drunk to care about the warning that chilled his spine. He went home and fell into bed, fully clothed, the events of the night fading with sleep. Connor jolted awake to a sound he couldn't quite place. The room was different. It wasn't his modern, sleek bedroom. The air was thick and smelled of burning wood. His bed was no longer the king-sized mattress with the Egyptian cotton sheets. Instead, he found himself lying on a firm straw mat. The walls were made of mud, and the soft glow of oil lamps flickered against them. His heart pounded in his chest as panic set in. Where was he? Connor stumbled outside, and his eyes widened in disbelief. He wasn't in Lagos anymore, or at least not the Lagos he knew. The roads were dirt paths, and the people, dressed in traditional wraps and faded agbada, moved about as though they belonged to another time. He caught sight of a newspaper lying on a bench and grabbed it. The date read, August 18, 1922. His knees nearly buckled. He was in the past. The people noticed him, too. His modern clothes stood out like a sore thumb, and whispers began to spread. "Stranger," they murmured. "Who is this one dressed like that?" Yet, despite their curiosity, they didn't seem hostile. A group of elderly men approached him, their faces lined with wisdom and age. They took him in without much question, offering him a place to stay. But Connor was terrified. Each night, he tossed and turned, haunted by dreams of the girl he had humiliated. Her voice echoed in his head, "You will learn," and he began to wonder if this was all her doing. Had she sent him here? Was this some kind of curse? Days turned into weeks, and Connor lived among the people of the 1920s. At first, he was treated with mild suspicion, but over time, the village accepted him. He learned how to fetch water from the well, how to grind millet, how to speak their dialect more fluently. But every day was a reminder that he didn't belong. The technology, the clothes, the customs, everything was alien to him. He was a man out of time, and no one knew how to help him return. One evening, while wandering through the village outskirts, Connor encountered a girl, her beauty striking and her presence almost ethereal. She wasn't like the others. There was something about her that made her seem older, wiser, though her face was as youthful as his. She stood by a tree, watching him with curious eyes. "You're lost," she said, her voice soft but piercing. Connor blinked. "Do you know me?" "I know of you," she replied. "I know why you're here." His heart raced. "Then you know how I can go back?" The girl stepped closer. "That depends. Have you learned?" Her question took him off guard. "Learned what?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That your actions have consequences. You've lived your life as though you were above everyone else, taking what you wanted, hurting people without care. This place is your lesson, Connor. The past. Here, you're nobody." Connor felt a surge of guilt wash over him as memories of the girl he had humiliated came flooding back. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he mumbled. "You did. And now you must make it right." The girl, who called herself Adesewa, became his guide. She took him to places in the village that held memories of his ancestors, ancient lands where prideful men had fallen and where the humble thrived. She spoke of balance, of how the arrogance of one man could disrupt the harmony of generations. Connor listened, for the first time in his life, really listened. Adesewa showed him the life of the girl he had wronged, how she had struggled, how his assault had humiliated her in front of others. Connor was filled with shame, but Adesewa wasn't done with him yet. "There is only one way for you to return," she said one night as they sat by the fire. "You must confront her, face the pain you caused, and make amends, not with words, but with humility." Connor's chest tightened. He didn't know how to face her, but he knew it was the only way. The next morning, Adesewa took him deep into the forest, to a place where the veil between the past and the present was thin. Connor could feel the energy in the air shift, a strange sensation that made his skin prickle. And there, standing in a clearing, was the girl, the same one he had humiliated. She was younger, just as beautiful, and yet her eyes held the weight of all that had happened. Connor dropped to his knees, unable to speak, the shame too much to bear. "I am sorry," he finally whispered. "I am truly sorry." The girl stepped forward, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Connor feared she would never forgive him. But then, something softened in her gaze. "You have learned," she said simply. The wind around them shifted, and suddenly, the forest began to dissolve into light, pulling Connor upward as if the world was spinning him back through time. He woke up in his bed, the sounds of traffic and city life outside his window. His heart pounded, but this time, it was different. He wasn't the same Connor who had gone to sleep the night before. The arrogance, the entitlement, it had melted away. He had learned, truly learned. From that day on, Connor vowed to live with humility, never forgetting the lesson he learned in the time between. Connor sat up in his bed, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. The familiar hum of Lagos city traffic drifted through the open window, but the sounds felt strange, distant, like he was hearing them for the first time. His chest tightened as the memories of the village, the people, and Adesewa flooded back into his mind. Had it all been a dream? He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his fingers brushing against the cool tiled floor. Everything looked the same, his lavish apartment, the expensive decor, the gadgets that littered his bedside table. But Connor wasn't the same. His mind raced back to that moment in the clearing, where the girl, the one he had hurt, had finally forgiven him. But had she? He stood up, moving to the mirror, and caught a glimpse of his reflection. There, barely noticeable on his wrist, was a thin, faded bracelet, woven from threads of palm fronds, something he had been given in the village. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a dream. Days passed, but Connor couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. He had returned to his old life, but nothing felt the same. The arrogance he once wore like a second skin had vanished, replaced by a heavy sense of unease. Even when he went back to his usual routine, parties, meetings, women, there was a hollow ache inside him. He couldn't forget Adesewa's words, "You must confront her." But hadn't he done that? Hadn't he faced the girl in the forest and begged for forgiveness? Late one night, after another restless evening, Connor found himself standing outside the gates of the estate where it had all started. The same corner where she had sold her oranges, where he had assaulted her in a fit of rage and entitlement. The street was quiet now, bathed in the glow of the streetlights. There was no sign of the girl. Connor's heart sank, guilt gnawing at him once more. Had she disappeared? Had he failed? As he turned to leave, a soft voice called out from the shadows. "Looking for me." His heart skipped a beat as he turned to see her. She stood in the same spot as before, her eyes as piercing and unreadable as ever. But something was different this time. She wasn't angry. She looked tired. Worn, like the weight of the world had rested on her shoulders. "You think this is over?" she asked, her voice cool, but with an undercurrent of pain. Connor's throat tightened. I thought, I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. I've changed." The girl stepped forward, her gaze sharp. You think an apology is enough? That simply saying sorry will undo the pain you caused. Her words were like daggers, slicing through his feeble excuses. Connor felt his knees weaken. No. I know it's not enough, he whispered. But I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I need to try. Without another word, she motioned for him to follow. Connor hesitated for only a moment before trailing behind her. She led him through a maze of narrow streets, far from the upscale neighborhoods he was used to. The air grew colder, the night darker, and soon they were in a part of the city Connor had never seen before, a forgotten place, where the buildings crumbled and the streets were lined with broken glass and faded dreams. At last, they arrived at a small house. It was old, decrepit, the paint peeling off the walls. The girl knocked softly, and after a moment, the door creaked open. Inside was a scene that made Connor's heart shatter. The girl's mother sat by a dying fire, her eyes red from crying. In the corner lay her younger brother, frail and sick, coughing quietly under a thin blanket. The room was cold, barely lit, and the air smelled of illness and despair. This is the consequence of your actions, the girl said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. The shame you put on me, the mockery, it cost us everything. We were barely surviving before. But now, no one will buy from me anymore. No one trusts us. Connor's chest tightened. The weight of what he had done, of how his arrogance had destroyed not just one life, but an entire family, hit him like a freight train. He felt sick, disgusted with himself. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You never cared to know, the girl snapped. People like you, rich, untouchable, you think you can step on anyone, break anyone, without consequences. Well, this is the consequence. Tears filled Connor's eyes as he fell to his knees in front of her. I'll fix this, he vowed. I'll do whatever it takes. The next weeks were a blur of action. Connor poured his wealth and resources into helping the girl and her family. He paid for her brother's medical bills, ensuring he got the best treatment available. He set her mother up with a steady business, ensuring she would never have to struggle again. And as for the girl, he worked tirelessly to restore her reputation, using his connections and influence to undo the damage he had caused. But it wasn't just about money. Connor spent time with them, real time. He listened to their stories, their struggles, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to care for someone other than himself. The more he gave, the more he realized how empty his old life had been. And through it all, Adesewa appeared to him in his dreams. She would watch him from a distance, sometimes smiling faintly, other times silently observing. He knew she was testing him, watching to see if he would truly change, or if this was just another phase. But Connor wasn't the same man he had been. He had learned humility, learned the value of empathy, and most importantly, learned that his actions had lasting consequences. Months later, as the girl's family began to rebuild their lives, Connor found himself standing in the same clearing in his dream, the one where he had first faced the girl in the past. But this time, he wasn't alone. Adesewa was there, her arms folded across her chest, watching him with those ancient eyes. You have done well, she said, her voice soft, but filled with pride. Connor smiled, though there was still sadness in his heart. It will never be enough, he said quietly. No, Adesewa agreed. But it's a start. And that's all you can do. Connor nodded, feeling the weight of the past finally lift from his shoulders. He had made things right, at least as right as he could. And as he stood there, under the stars, he realized that the real journey was just beginning. Back in the present day, Connor no longer cared for the parties, the money, or the power that once defined him. Instead, he dedicated his life to helping those he had once overlooked, the people who had been invisible to him for so long. He had learned his lesson, not just in words, but in action. And though the girl who had taught him that lesson had faded from his life, her memory would stay with him forever. Because sometimes, the hardest journey isn't the one through time, but the one that takes place inside yourself.